Point out the correct statement. Option A says, there is always a conformity between truth and knowledge. This is incorrect. We can see that from the second paragraph, the last statement of the second paragraph. And such a fundamental ontological belief is what I take to underlie the correspondence theory of truth, that if knowledge is to conform to truth, then it somehow must represent and correspond to the real thing that exists, things that exist independently of us. So knowledge and truth correspond to each other only when, according to the author, real things exist independently of us. So this is the only situation where truth and knowledge conform or correspond with each other. So there is always a conformity. That is not true. We can eliminate A. Option B says, ontological realism is essentially more realistic than phenomenal realism. Now, this is not an exact view of the author. Even then, even so, we can still see that this is incorrect. This is contradictory to what the passage says. We see this from the fourth paragraph. Phenomenalists can regard their views as essentially more realistic than ontological realism by their faithfulness to our fundamental epistemological belief. So, according to the phenomenalists, the other way around, the inverse of this is true. Phenomenal realism is more realistic than ontological realism. And we can see from the following statements, the statements following the reference, that the author seems to agree with this. So B is directly in contradiction with the information given. It's incorrect. Option C tells us when knowledge represents things which exist independently, then it can be close to truth. This is true. We have already seen the reference. It is given at the end of the second paragraph, and such a fundamental ontological belief is what I take to underlie the correspondence theory of truth, that if knowledge is to conform to truth, then it somehow must represent and correspond to real things that exist independently of us. So real things existing independently, which is the ontological belief that the author talks about in the first paragraph, it is at this point where knowledge conforms to the truth. And so we can say that knowledge representing things which exist independently can come close to the truth, or it corresponds to the truth. So this is quite true. We can qualify this as a valid answer. Option D tells us epistemological realism is always in agreement with the principle of separability of substance. Now, we have to look at two different references in order to eliminate this option. We find that this is actually wrong. Again, this is contradictory to the passage. First off, we look at the first paragraph. It establishes that ontological and epistemological realism or thought process are opposed to each other. We see that in the first line. The real basis of the problem of knowledge is that the requirements of ontology and epistemology pull in different directions. Next up, we introduce the aspect of independence of existence of things. We seem to have a fundamental ontological belief, the question of existence above, that real things exist independently of each other. They can come into existence and pass out of existence, and this can occur without affecting other things insofar as they exist. So we find that it is the ontological belief that things exist independently of each other, that they can come into existence and pass out of existence without affecting other things insofar as they exist. Next up, we look at the second paragraph, the first line of the second paragraph, which introduces the aspect of the principle, or the principium, as it is mentioned here, of separability of substance. The belief may be formalized into a special principle, principium, of the separability of substance, that the existence of a substantial object, as opposed to a quality or attribute, means that it can be separated from other objects to go on its own isolated existential fate. We see that this is talking about the same thing as this. Real things exist independently of each other, as in the existence of substantial objects, as opposed to a quality or attribute, means that it can be separated from other objects and it can go about its own isolated existential fate. So the separability of substance is talking about the same ontological belief as the question of existence, that real things exist independently of each other. The belief that we are talking about here relates to this ontological belief, and that we can see from the last statement of the first paragraph. Be that as it may, such a belief, and we see the lines before this, they refer to various examples of this belief. So they don't give any contradictory evidence. The ontological belief is further expanded upon, or it is talked about here. Be that as it may, such a belief, which refers to the ontological belief, seems to me to underlie actually or potentially as a Socratic presupposition many common sense and philosophical sophisticated views about the world, and I will take it to stand as the fundamental common principle of all forms of ontological realism. So when I say this belief, the aspects of the question of existence, the independence of real things with each other, the separability of substance, they are all talking about the same thing, and this relates to ontological realism. And as we have already established from the first statement, the requirements of ontology and epistemology pull in different directions. So ontology and epistemology are contradictory to each other. So to say that epistemological realism is in agreement, not even always, just to say that it is in agreement with the principle of separability of substance is quite incorrect. It is ontological realism that is in agreement with the principle of separability of substance, and epistemology, being contradictory to ontology, thus can be seen to be contradictory, inverse to the principle of separability of substance. So we find that this option is quite incorrect. We can eliminate it. We can eliminate option B. The correct answer is option C.